Good morning. Our last supplemental lecture for the quarter, this is just going to be on 16th century art in Northern Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. Essentially, the last two chapters and the last exam that we had has covered only Italy, 15th and 16th century, so essentially the Renaissance in Italy. And now we want to look at the Renaissance outside of Italy in the 16th century, because that's really the High Renaissance, and we want to see how it manifests itself in other parts of Europe. So you're going to see this is a pretty abbreviated lecture because we've got like 3 student presentations on Thursday, so I will not talk about the artists that they're going to be talking about. We have Albrecht, Durer, El Greco, and Hieronymus Bosch are all people that we're just going to skip those slides. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the Reformation of the arts because of the Protestant Reformation. And essentially, there have been lots of dissonant movements that challenged the Roman Catholic Church through the centuries. But up until this point, it really didn't work out in the end. The Pope always prevailed. But by the 16th century, this finally ended. It's actually religious reformers within the Catholic Church which challenged its practices, and then eventually, after looking at those practices, they started to challenge the very beliefs of the Catholic Church. There was a couple of people, priests within the Catholic Church who were trained theologians, Desiderius Erasmus, and specifically, importantly, Martin Luther, who was a German priest. And he issued those 95 theses, which you may have heard of. They called for the church reform. The thing that was happening, there were financial abuses going on, decadent lifestyles of the clergy. So, like, they were quite wealthy and they were living a very, a decadent lifestyle that didn't really make sense with the things that they were preaching. So his major concerns, Martin Luther's major concerns, among these were the selling of indulgences and the excessive veneration of relics. So we've talked a lot about veneration of relics in this class, but the selling of indulgences isn't something that we've covered as much. That was essentially the church saying, if you pay us money, you will get into heaven, or your relatives will get into heaven. And Martin Luther said, well, that doesn't make sense. You shouldn't have to pay money to get into heaven. It should be about how pious you are, how much you pray, and how you believe, and how you practice it, not whether you give money to the church. So eventually, they had to break away from Rome entirely because it became clear that the Roman Catholic Church did not want to hear the things that he had to say, and they condemned Luther in 1521, and so eventually they really had to break away from Rome. So because of the increased literacy in Europe, they had the widespread use of the printing press. This aided reformers and allowed scholars throughout Europe to enter the religious debate. So that played a major role in this. Martin Luther's writings led to the establishment of the Protestant or the Lutheran Church in Germany. So you'll hear those terms interchangeably. In Germany, Luther's writings, especially his German translation of the Bible and his works maintaining that salvation comes from faith alone, eventually led to the establishment of this church. By the end of the 16th century, Protestantism prevailed throughout Northern Europe. So outside of Italy, where we really see Catholicism reign supreme, we're going to see Protestantism in the other parts of Europe. John Calvin in Switzerland led another Protestant revolt. Henry VIII in England did as well. So by the end of the 16th century, it prevailed, like I said. And during this time, Europe was racked by religious war, which had a grave impact on artists and art. So widespread iconoclasm, we know what iconoclasm is, that's image breaking. But also we know that careers came to an end because The artists perhaps had reformist religious sympathies, so they decided they did not want to create art for Catholic patrons anymore, or that the basic tenets or the subjects of their work were no longer valid. As Protestantism grew, actually the Catholic artists were persecuted and had to leave, so that was difficult. There was also widespread destruction of religious art. That's where iconoclasm comes in, to rid the world of idols. We know that, and then loss of patronage for religious art happened, and then many turned to portraiture and secular subjects. We'll see, even so, in many places, art is still, there's a lot of art, but it just tends to be more secular. And I should just mention that Luther never supported iconoclasm, so Martin Luther never said you should destroy art, but it still happened in a lot of places. So let's talk about Germany first and foremost. This is our first student presentation. It just happens to be the first image in the chapter, so I just want to mention Albrecht Durer, but I don't want to talk about it too much. We'll just leave him up here while I talk about Germany. So you'll notice for the exam on your slide ID packet, you're going to have different parts of Europe as your style, like when you have to decide you're going to name the artist's name, you're going to name the title of the piece, and then you're going to say whether it's from Germany or whether it's from the Netherlands or whether it's from England. So you'll see on your packet that I've laid those out for you. But just in general, so we're in Germany right now, German-speaking regions, in the German-speaking regions, arts flourished until religious upheaval and iconoclastic purges took their toll. And so, in response, the Germans ordered a lot of portraits for their wealthy middle class. This is a lot like what we were seeing in the Netherlands 100 years before, where it's like people are self-made. They have a lot of wealth, not from religion, but just from like inherited wealth, but just because they're wealthy merchants or they're self-made. And entrepreneurial artists like Albrecht Dürer became major commercial successes. And the whole thing about this portrait, which Erica might tell us, he's doing kind of a Christ gesture with his hand here. And he said, "The more we know, the more we resemble the likeness of Christ, who truly knows all things." So, yeah, I don't want to step on any toes, but this is his kind of nod to the fact that he was religious and pious, and actually he was a Lutheran, so he was not a Catholic, and this image, though to many might seem a little bit kind of full of yourself, comparing yourself to Jesus, but I guess during the time this wasn't taken that way. We just are meant to look at it and understand that he's very proud of himself as an artist, and that we should we should commission his work. Okay, so painting in Germany. We have two very different German artists that have come down to us from the first decades of the 16th century. Albrecht Dürer is one of them, and Matthias Grünwald is the other. Durer gives us this intense observation of the world, a lifelike representation of nature. He gives us mathematical perspective and reasoned canons of proportion, but Grünwald gives us currents of medieval mysticism and emotional spirituality. This is the Isenheim Altarpiece. It is closed at this point, and this is important because there's many views of this, and you need to know that if you saw this on the, just recognize that you're going to see a couple of different views of this, that there's closed and opened. So Grünwald was a man of many talents. He worked as an architect, a hydraulic engineer, and a painter. For the Isenheim Altarpiece, he painted one set of fixed wings and two sets of movable ones, and then also a set of panels to cover the predella. So let's look at some of these. This is for the Abbey of St. Anthony in Isenheim, and that had a hospital to care for patients with skin diseases, including the plague, leprosy, and St. Anthony's fire. St. Anthony's fire is a really interesting disease, which is caused by eating grains which are infected with the ergot fungus. So it essentially, a lot of these are skin irritations and things that will lead to death. Okay, but the box is essentially, the altarpiece is essentially a box of statues covered by these folding wings. And it could be displayed in different ways depending on the church calendar. This particular shot is what they would have seen on weekdays. It's a grisly scene of the crucifixion. And we have Saint Sebastian and Anthony, who are both associated with the plague, standing on these pedestals, which are trompe-l'oeil, or fool's eye, as we know. So there we go. These, what I'm talking about is here on the sides. I just want automatic. Here we go. Okay. Sorry, guys. So here are the trompe-l'oeil pedestals. And the reason for some of this grisaille, this is something that like goes back a long ways into medieval altarpieces. They're trying to, we will see grisaille on the outside, or rather that grayscale, or that sort of kind of trying to trick us into believing that we're looking at actual architecture, because they were trying to mimic what was on the outside of the church as you were coming in. We'll see better examples of this later, and hopefully when we talk about when we talk about the Bosch paintings, we'll see more references to that. But, okay, I'm lost my place. But, okay, so grisly depiction of crucifixion, Saint Sebastian and Saint Anthony, and the lamentation below. So we recognize all of these things. At this point, we're very, very familiar with the Christian vocabulary and the artistic vocabulary and what we're expecting to see. So what's interesting is Christ seems already to be decaying. There's clotted blood, an open mouth, blue lips, and an ashen body. His fingers are cramped in rigor mortis. I mean, that's pretty grotesque. And I think that for an altarpiece that's essentially outside of a hospital that's intended for the sick and dying, it was probably very intense. And I think when you have something like leprosy where you're not a biologist, but when your skin is sort of rotting, it feels like it's rotting off your body, this must have been very poignant. Okay, so upon the first opening, we see a different scene. You can see it in situ. Okay, so on first opening here, there is a different scene. The Annunciation, Nativity, and Resurrection, which is appropriate for Sundays and feast days. These are events of great joy. There are patients praying in front of, if a patient came and prayed in front of this, they must have hoped for miraculous recovery. This is not for, but it's okay, so for the record, just so you know, this is what it would have, just want you guys to be able to see in a little bit closer, some close-ups of the wings when they're open. And then just for reference, not for slide ID, I just want you to see what this would have looked like when it was completely open, right? Okay, so that we've seen two openings now, and this is what's completely inside. And it's around Nicholas Hagenauer's carved altarpiece, which was reserved for special festivals of St. Anthony. And on the left here, you see St. Anthony meeting the hermit St. Paul, and on the right, Grunwald painted a self-portrait as St. Paul. See if yeah, okay, here we go. There's the left-hand side. So St. Anthony meeting with St. Paul the hermit, and on the right, whoa, that's crazy. There apparently in the desert, and there's many medicinal herbs. No, that doesn't make any sense. Here, that makes sense that we're surrounded by medicinal herbs. Here, we've got St. Anthony being attacked by demons, which we should recognize from Schongauer's print, which they certainly would have seen, the Temptations of St. Anthony. We remember that particular story. So that's what's going on there. Sorry for the confusion. Okay, so let's kind of skip through the Albrecht Dürer prints. These are amazing, and I recommend reading about them fully in the book, and hopefully the student presentation will cover this. I know she'll do a great job. And if she doesn't, we'll talk about more of them. If she doesn't cover everything, we'll talk about these again in class. Okay, so Martin Luther had a favorite artist. This artist was Lucas Cranach the Elder. And he did woodcuts as well as altarpieces and many portraits. We can see here just how different the German's conception of the figure basically differs from the Italian Renaissance. So, I mean, what does this call to mind? Perhaps Titian. It's a very, very different view of the reclining nude. Instead of taking inspiration from the ancients, Cranach here finds his inspiration in a 15th century inscription on a fountain beside the Danube. So it says, "I am the nymph of the sacred font. Do not interrupt my sleep, for I am at peace." The Danube landscape here is recorded with characteristic northern attention. Here she's cast aside her velvet gown, her red velvet gown, but she still wears her jewelry, which kind of actually sexualizes it, I think, without the indications of the clothing that she was wearing and the jewelry that she still is wearing, the nudity wouldn't be as sexualized in a strange way. Here, he is not working for a Protestant patron. If he had been, that wouldn't have been okay. The earthly beauty was sinful. But here, he just seems to delight in earthly things. So it's very, very interested in that attention to the natural world, which is so characteristic of the Northern Renaissance. Okay, this is one of my, it's like such a creepy picture, one of my favorites. So Hans Bolden, we think that he was, well, actually, no, he was named that because green was his favorite color. This is just, green is just, that's just what it means. And he just was trying to distinguish himself from other Hanses, because there were lots of Hans artists working at this point. He eventually joined Durer's workshop in 1505. He was a painter, a printmaker, and a stained glass designer. He created a series of paintings on this theme, the death of the matron. So he here juxtaposes sensuality with mortality, voluptuousness, decay, attraction, and repulsion. We see the nude, but then we realize that she's not being stroked by her lover, but by death instead. It takes place in a cemetery, and even though he's giving us a warning about sexualization and the evils and the sinful nature of exploring sexuality in this way, he also depends upon the viewer to look at the image and find it to be sexually appealing. He wants erotic engagement from the viewer to make the moral message personal. He's warning against the transitory pleasures of the flesh. There's another example of one of the pieces from that series, the same theme. All right, let's talk about France. So France has got its own issues. They finally decide, I think in 1521, they decide to make Protestantism accepted because they've just got people fighting each other like crazy and they're sick of all the killing. And so they say, okay, you can be Protestant, you can be Catholic, whatever you want. Just don't kill each other anymore. So immediately after his ascent to the throne, this man, Francis I, he wants to modernize the French court by inviting Leonardo da Vinci, who we are familiar with, to come paint for him. He was officially to advise the king. So you remember Leonardo was not just a painter, for a court painter, but he was also there to advise for all kinds of things, military, etc. He invited him to come advise about royal architectural projects. And the king said mainly for the pleasure of his conversation. I bet Leonardo da Vinci was really, really fun to talk to. But not all of the painters for Francis I were were Italian. In this case, we have Jean Clouet, who actually technically was from the Netherlands, but we're going to call it France anyway, because the book does. But so yeah, for slide ID, this is France. So he found favor, Jean Clouet, who sounds French, he found favor at the royal court as a portrait painter. And here, Clouet softens the king's distinctive features, shading and highlighting the nervous actions of his fingers. So you can see that there's movement there, but it's nice. It's a nice, flattering portrait. We think probably the beautiful and complex costuming would have been painted separately from the portrait itself, right? So a lot of times in these portraits, we're going to see it more and more if you come with me into 103, but the elaborate fabric, all that stuff, you can do that later. Don't make the king sit for just while you paint the shirt. Make him sit for the likeness, and then have somebody else wear the costume. So yeah, and then a prototype was sketched and used as a model for numerous replicas, which would have been used for diplomatic or family purposes. Okay, let's talk about a very famous building, the Palais du Louvre in Paris. Francis I, the man we were just looking at, made Paris his bureaucratic seat, and the Ile-de-France, which is that Paris region, if you recall from when we were looking at the Gothic cathedrals, took the artistic lead. So we see Ile-de-France making waves and being a very important center for the arts. It gave birth to a style of French classicism, and he decided to remodel a medieval castle, the Louvre. Work began in 1546 with the replacement of the west wing of the square court, or cour carrée, by architect Pierre Lescaut, working with Jean Goujon. It combines Renaissance ideals of balance and regularity with classical architectural detail and rich sculptural decoration. The roof line had been irregular, but they gave it rounded arches and horizontal balustrades. So we recognize that these arches are going to be very classical. They remind us of the Renaissance in Italy, but on top of that, there's also this. Okay, so they've taken away the Gothic buttresses, but there's some of this very elaborate decoration at the top here that is quite flamboyant. So it really recalls that French flamboyant style. The classical pilasters and acanthus replacing Gothic colonnettes and cusps, but still, this is a very uniquely French style of building. Okay, I just want to give you some other examples of what's going on in architecture. I think this is also in the book. I decided not to address it. This is a chateau. So there's only like one or two vocab words on this test, and so I've just put them in multiple choice section, but the chateau is essentially just like a regal, but it's like a palace, a rural palace that in this case got turned into a bridge. But I want you guys to be able to recognize the Palais du Louvre specifically for slide ID. Oh, there's that flamboyant architecture I was talking about. We didn't spend that much time with it because it's kind of at the end of the Gothic period in France, but remember, looks kind of like flames. Okay, so then moving into Spain, this is the work of El Greco, who was known as Domenikos Theotokopoulos was his name, because he was Greek, and he arrived in Spain, and they just called him El Greco, or the Greek. So I'll let student presentation take care of this. Timothy's doing it, so we won't touch on El Greco, but really, really cool artist. Yeah, cool. Studied under Titian and really paid attention to Parmigianino. You see that on the left. I'm sorry, Prontormo. Okay. And then we're moving again to another artist, which I'm not going to talk about, Hieronymus Bosch. Just totally amazing, really interesting artist that gives us something that we really haven't seen before and feels very modern. I will talk more about this if we find out that student presentation doesn't cover all of the same things that are in the book that I want on the test, but we'll just kind of not do this right now. There's that grisaille grayscale on the outside I was talking about. That's very typical of these altarpieces. Okay, so you know it's traditional. Okay, Gossart, St. Luke painting. So, or in this case, I think our book refers to it as St. Luke drawing the Virgin Mary. Here we see, and can I zoom in? Well, that's another St. Luke image we'll look at in a second. So St. Luke's eyes are closed. You have to trust me on this. His hand is the hand of the angel. So you see that his hand here is being led by the angel. So he doesn't actually have to look to see. He's not literally staring at the Virgin Mary here. He's being shown what to draw by an angel. And so it's always difficult for an artist. How does one imagine the Virgin Mary? So here the Protestant Reformation has begun. It's kind of like he's wondering about this. What's okay to paint? How does one paint the Virgin Mary? And reflecting on it in his painting. But he's also saying if Luke did it, if Luke painted the Virgin Mary, remember St. Luke is the patron saint of the arts, and because he painted the Virgin and Child, what's the problem if Luke did it? Why can't I do it? Because Protestantism is kind of questioning whether you're allowed to paint the Virgin Mary. The architectural space mirrors the two tables that Moses holds. So here's Moses up here. I say tables. I'm sorry, tablets. I'm misreading my own handwriting. So the two tablets up here is mirrored in the architectural space that we're looking at. It's perhaps a reference to Roger van der Weeden's 15th century painting of the same subject. Okay, Pietro Bruegel the Elder. This is a very famous painting. I believe I've removed a slide here. You can take that out of slide ID. Just move from the Gossart painting to Holbein's painting. If I can't remember if I included that in the handout, but don't worry about it. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, now I've really confused myself. Oh, I think I was worried that there was going to be a student presentation on this. Okay, I'm going to skip those. I will talk about those in class because I do, or rather, just do your reading in the book about Peter Bruegel. I can't pause here in my presentation, otherwise I would pull up some more notes, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. So I seem to have skipped over this. Let's just move on to Hans Holbein, because this is a very interesting piece, and we'll talk about it more in class on Thursday. Okay. This painting, The Ambassadors, is about what we can't see. The man on the left is the person who commissioned the painting. He's very wealthy over here. On the right is his friend Georges. There's lots of objects in this painting which should remind us of other Netherlandish paintings. We see references to the heavens, to time, to astronomy. So a globe. We have all kinds of different instruments for measuring time and for, like I said, astronomy. Also a globe, terrestrial spheres. And then down here, this lute, which has a snapped string, which you can't really see, a hymn book, lyrics from Martin Luther down here that are open. So we know that this is a Protestant painting. The floor here is a reference to an actual floor in Westminster, which has a diagram of the macrocosm or the cosmic order. But you will notice that there's something else funny going on the floor. And that, as we have spoken about before, we see the memento mori or a reminder of death, which I will also put somewhere on your test, let you know. I want to make sure that you know what a memento mori is, because it's very important going forward with art history. So we see these earthly achievements first, and then we see that there's this skull that's kind of hidden in the middle of the floor. But there's a very strange distortion to it. And the point of this distortion is that it is actually meant to be seen from the side. If you're looking at it from the side, you can see the skull in perfect perspective. So let's take a look at that. If you're looking at the painting from the side of the painting, that's what you will see, which is totally impressive. You can see that. There's a black and white photo of it if you're standing on the side. So we think at first that this painting is about earthly achievements, but then we find it might be about the opposite. That perhaps what we see in life is not everything, that we need to look closer and be reminded of death. I'm just shocked at how someone would be able to achieve this, because it's a very, very difficult optical illusion that Holbein has achieved here. All right, let's talk about England. Okay, so the Tudor period, it's the period between 1485 and 1603 in England and Wales, and includes the Elizabethan period during the reign of Elizabeth I until 1603. There's a lot of people know a lot about the Tudor period. We're not going to talk a ton about it here, but it coincides with the dynasty of the House of Tudor in England, whose first monarch was Henry VII. In terms of the entire span, the historian John Guy argues that England was economically healthier, more expansive, and more optimistic under the Tudors than at any time in 1,000 years. Elizabeth's reign is known as the Elizabethan Era, which is the period which is famous for the flourishing of English drama led by the playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and for the seafaring prowess of English adventurers such as Francis Drake. Despite the disruption caused by the Reformation, Tudor England was politically and economically stable. Music, literature, and architecture flourished, as we know. Painting was principally, though, left to foreigners. We don't see a lot of paintings that we associate with English painters. Queen Elizabeth here was carefully controlled her representation. And again, we see an artist who is Flemish, but we're going to qualify it as an English painting because it is of English royalty, but they did not ask English painters to do their painting for them. It's going to take a long time for English painters to become popular. Okay, so it's a hieratic image. It's very stark. Marcus Gerhardt typifies the look she was after. It is called, kind of more famously, the Ditchley Portrait, because it seems to have been commissioned by Ditchley, the estate of her courtier. This is more about costume than actual body underneath the costume. She stands upon a map of her realm. There is pale abstraction and kind of it's a very severe face. She doesn't look particularly realistic. She's in control of not only England, right? So she's standing upon a map of her realm. So she's in control of England, but she's also in control of nature. So she's got all this images of nature behind her and some control of herself. She exhibits much, much control. So this is exactly how she wanted to be portrayed. This is Hardwicke Hall, so some more architecture for you. This is one of the grandest of all Elizabethan houses, and it is home of Bess of Hardwicke, who is a countess. She inherited the riches from all four of her deceased husbands. She was in her 70s when she got all this money, when she had this built. She asked Robert Smithson, who was England's first Renaissance architect, to build this for her. It was a medieval great hall which was transformed into a two-story entrance hall with rooms arranged symmetrically around it. It has a nod to classical balance, but I've got to say it's very, very stark. Sort of reminds me of that painting of Elizabeth. we will see in general that if you continue on with me, we will see that architecture in England just follows the same very strict, balanced, and austere path. Not much decoration. I know there's a little bit going up on the rooftops here, but if you were to compare it to the Louvre or to any of those French buildings which have that background of flamboyant architecture and the heavy influence of Gothic, this just does not feel the same way. It feels much more kind of undecorated. Okay, so I think that's the end. I know we sort of jumped through a few things, so I'm just going to be prepared on Thursday to cover anything that doesn't get covered. We'll also do a review for the test, and yeah, I hope that was helpful, you guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, bye.